5. Akaba's Underwater Military Museum. In July of 2019, the world's first ever underwater military museum was created off the shores of Akaba, Jordan in the Red Sea. It took 30 days of planning before a total of 21 wartime vehicles were sunk into the sea in battle formation. The launch ceremony took place on July 25th, and Akaba Special Economic Zone Authority's Chief Commissioner, Naya Bakit, stated that it's the first product of its kind in the region. The site draws in tourists from all over the world. The vehicles that were sunk include tanks of varying sizes, a military crane, an ambulance, anti-aircraft guns, a combat helicopter, and a troop carrier. ASEZA oversaw the whole project, and in their press release, they said that all of the hazardous material were removed from the equipment in order to comply with the environmental best practices. Everything was meticulously planned, and even the location for the museum was precisely chosen due to its lack of coral and marine life. Those involved in the creation of the Underwater Museum are hopeful that the new attraction will not only lure in more divers to Akaba, but that it'll also help to alleviate the heavy burden of increased tourism on their local coral reefs. The head of ASEZA's Beaches Administration, Abdullah Abu Awali, claims that the new artificial sites will reduce the pressure on the area's natural coral reefs. All of the machines were sunk in depths ranging from 49 to 92 feet from the surface, which allows visitors to enjoy the underwater attraction through snorkeling, scuba diving, and glass-bottom boat tours as well. In the years to come, ASEZA says that the military museum will grow as new equipment becomes available. 4. Lockheed L-1011 TriStar. The L-1011 TriStar is an American-made wide-body medium to long-range tri-jet airliner. Built by the Lockheed Corporation and was first flown in November of 1970. After 6 long years of unforeseeable setbacks, the California-based company unveiled the unique aircraft with state-of-the-art features. The TriStar's flight control system, speed control, navigation system, direct lift control system, stability system, and autopilot were all superior to any similar craft built around the same time. It first entered service with Eastern Airlines in 1942, equipped with its one-of-a-kind engine that was surprisingly manufactured solely by Rolls-Royce. The plane was roughly 242,500 pounds, 178 feet long, and had a top speed of 605 miles per hour. Between the years of 1968 and 1984, a total of 250 TriStars were assembled by Lockheed at their plant in Southern California at the Palmdale Regional Airport. However, the aircraft sales were severely hampered over a 2-year period of financial and developmental problems at Rolls-Royce. Production eventually came to a complete halt because of the plane's below-target sales. The last TriStar was delivered in 1984. Interestingly, ASEZA in Jordan acquired one of these planes that had been out of service and was parked at King Hussein International Airport for many years. They purchased the TriStar with the intention of sinking it into the Red Sea. ASEZA had already sunk the military aircraft Hercules C-130 in November of 2017, and they thought the TriStar would fit in nicely as a new attraction to the dive site. The plane was dismantled, transferred to Akaba's main port, and then reassembled. After several proposed sinking sites were uncovered, ASEZA's technical team began scanning along the Jordanian coast to find the perfect place for the TriStar. They eventually decided on a location for the scuttling near the old port of Phosphate, and it was finally sunk in August of 2019 at a depth of 59 to 92 feet. This new addition is just one of the many machines you can find under the water in Akaba, Jordan, and it's considered to be part of the Underwater Military Museum dive site that we mentioned previously. The TriStar was sunk in a spot that's completely free of coral reefs, and it sits in a space with wide, flat, sandy regions. There are seagrass meadows surrounding the plane, and the presence of the aircraft will begin to allow the creation of new artificial coral reefs, which will act as a habitat for fish and other marine life. The plane was sunk at a depth range that makes it a perfect dive site for tourists to explore, and freedivers, scuba divers, and snorkelers are now able to experience this amazing underwater aircraft for themselves. 3. Christ of the Abyss. On the Italian Riviera, just off the coast of San Fruttuoso, located in the Mediterranean Sea, sits an eerie 9-foot bronze statue of Jesus Christ known as Christ of the Abyss. The statue was created by the Italian artist and sculptor Guido Galletti in 1954 and was placed under the water on August 22nd of that same year. Galletti melted and fused together medals, bells, and naval artifacts in order to acquire the large amount of bronze needed for his creation. It rests at a depth of 56 feet below the surface and was inspired by Duilio Marcante, an Italian diver. He was a true pioneer of diving techniques, and he wanted to dedicate the statue in honor of his friend Dario Gonzatti. Dario had been the first ever Italian to use scuba gear for his dives, and he tragically passed away near the location where Christ of the Abyss now rests. The statue depicts Jesus Christ offering a benediction of peace, and he has his hands and head raised towards the sky. It now acts as a point of reference for divers in distress, and it's since become a symbol for all scuba divers. This spot is a unique experience for anyone who visits. The natural beauty of the protected marine area is hard to beat. Due to its location in relatively shallow waters, the statue has protection from the bay against powerful winds, which makes this a fairly easy dive site. Interestingly, there are several other bronze statues in various other locations, cast from the same mold as the original Christ of the Abyss. One of these replicas was placed in the waters in the St. George, Grenada coastline in October of 1961. It was offered as a gift from the Navy of Genoa for assistance in the rescue of the crew from the Italian vessel Bianca C, which had caught fire and burned just outside St. George's port. Then, there's also a third statue located in the water that was placed roughly 6 miles off the coast of Key Largo, Florida. This replica was presented to the Underwater Society of America in 1962 in New York by Egidio Cresci, an Italian dive equipment manufacturer. This incarnation was submerged in the John Pennekamp Coral Reef State Park near Dry Rocks, and incidentally became the United States' first ever underwater park. If you could create your own underwater statue, what would it be? Let us know in the comments and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 2. Japan's Sunken Pyramids. One of the craziest mysteries in all of Japan is the nature and origin of certain underwater stone structures that lie at the bottom of the sea off the coast of Yonaguni Island. Masaki Kimura, a Japanese marine biologist, has identified a total of 10 structures near Yonaguni and another 5 similar structures off the main island of Okinawa. The sunken architecture includes the ruins of a castle, 5 temples, a triumphal arch, and at least 1 giant stadium, all of which are connected by water channels and roads. Surrounding these sunken buildings is what researchers believe to be the partial remains of the retaining walls. All of the discovered ruins cover an area of about 984 feet by 492 feet. Also found among the rubble was an inscription on a rock that appears to belong to the ancient Kaida script. It was a writing system used by the Yaeyama Islands as well as Yonaguni Island before Japan's current education system was introduced. The relics date back to at least 5,000 years ago, according to Kimura, based on the dating of stalactites found inside underwater caves which are believed to have sank along with the city. However, the most insane structure that's found in this lost Japanese city is an 82-foot monolithic, a complicated building that many believe to be a stepped pyramid. The Yonaguni formations were first noticed by a local diver in 1986 and have since been visited by numerous researchers and tourists. There are some experts that believe the site could be what's left of Mu, which is a fabled Pacific civilization that was rumored to have vanished beneath the water. Toru Uchi, a professor of seismology at Kobe University, visited the ruins of the lost city and says he's touched the pyramid himself. He is in support of Kimura's hypothesis, which states that the amazing underwater formation is likely man-made and not created naturally. But there are many who oppose this theory, like Robert Scotch from Boston University, who's proposed that the holes in the rock were merely created by underwater eddies scouring and depressions. He also thinks that circles of smaller holes were likely created by marine creatures. The underwater structure, known today as the Yonaguni Monument, is one of the world's most unusual sights. It's even been nicknamed Japan's Atlantis and is a rectangular stacked pyramid-like monument and is believed to be more than 10,000 years old. There seem to be perfectly shaped stone steps with amazingly straight edges that many believe could not have been created naturally. Scotch and other skeptics claim that the area at which this structure was discovered is prone to earthquakes and could be the reason for the fascinating geological phenomenon. However, nothing has been confirmed as of today, and it's still unknown as to whether the Yonaguni Monument really is an ancient pyramid or if it's just a unique and natural underwater formation. 1. The city of Heraklion. In the year 2000, a team led by Frank Goddio, a French marine archaeologist from the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, made a fascinating discovery in the Mediterranean Sea. An ancient city that was engulfed underwater nearly 1,500 years ago had been rediscovered for the first time and was identified as the lost city of Heraklion. Heraklion was once the largest port city in all of Egypt and dates back as early as the 12th century BC. It has many links to ancient Greece and flourished long ago during the times of the pharaohs. Sadly, the city was devastated over the years and had been weakened by a combination of tsunamis, rising sea levels, and earthquakes, according to archaeologists. Towards the end of the 2nd century BC, possibly after a severe flood, the massive buildings of Heraklion collapsed and disappeared into the water. Some of the city's inhabitants continued to stay in the remaining ruins that were left, but by the end of 8th century AD, the entirety of Heraklion sank into the Mediterranean. Today, many incalculable treasures have already been brought up from the city's watery grave and have been put on display around the globe, which allows us to get a glimpse into the ancient Egyptian and Greek world. In the city's prime, it was located just 20 miles northeast of Alexandria, but its remains can now be found in Abu Qir Bay, situated roughly 1.5 miles from the coast. Heraklion amazingly sits only 30 feet under the water, and it's surprising that it wasn't discovered earlier. Heraklion, also known by its Egyptian name Thonis, was originally constructed on a couple of adjoining islands in the Nile Delta. The city was intersected by a number of canals with separate anchorages and harbors. At its peak, there were amazing temples and tower houses linked by bridges, ferries, and pontoons in the late period of ancient Egypt. This place was the country's main port for the collection of taxes and international trade. After the great city sank about 2,000 years ago, Goddio's team, with collaboration from the Egyptian Supreme Council, were the first to rediscover it beneath the Mediterranean Sea. On Goddio's own website, he explains that the objects that were recovered from the excavations illustrated the city's glory and beauty. He says that the magnificence of their grand temples, colossal statues, architectural elements and inscriptions, coins and jewelry and ritual ceramics all show evidence of a civilization frozen in time. Goddio and his team uncovered priceless treasures from their excavations, which include part of a temple dedicated to Amun/Heracles, a bronze statue of the king or god Osiris, and a ginormous red granite statue of the fertility god Hapi. Since these objects have been brought back to land, they're now on display at the Grand Egyptian Museum located in Cairo. When Heraklion was discovered back in 2000, Goddio estimated that not even 5% of the city had been discovered, meaning there was still a lot to find in the Mediterranean Sea. When his team went back to the site for another mission in 2021, they found a Ptolemaic galley submerged beneath the waters, which they believe was sunk after it was hit by giant blocks from the Temple of Amun. This find was extremely rare, and it's only the second fast galley to be discovered from this time period. Excavations at the site are still ongoing to this day, and who knows what other amazing artifacts they'll find in the coming years.
Runit Dome. On a remote stretch of white coral sand in the central Pacific, 5,000 miles or 8,046 kilometers west of Los Angeles, and 500 miles or 804 kilometers north of the equator, a big, old, and worn-out concrete dome bobs up and down with the tide. More than 3.1 million cubic feet, or 35 Olympic-sized swimming pools, of radioactive soil and debris created by the United States are stored under Runit Dome here in the Marshall Islands. The amount of radioactive waste, including fatal amounts of plutonium, that the US has given to another nation as a result of its Cold War atomic testing program is unprecedented. US officials later cleaned up contaminated soil there after conducting a dozen biological weapons experiments and dumping 130 tons of dirt from an irradiated Nevada testing site on the Eniwetok Atoll. The United States has also detonated the majority of its weapons tests at this location. The most dangerous debris and dirt from the atoll were then added to the dome. The concrete coffin, known as the tomb by the villagers, is now in danger of collapse due to increasing sea levels and other consequences of climate change. Every year, as faraway glaciers melt and ocean levels rise, the tides creep up its sides. The US government has rejected requests for assistance from Marshall Islands officials because they claim the dome is on Marshallese territory, meaning it's their responsibility. Runit Dome is widely regarded as the Republic of Marshall Islands' most obvious example of the nuclear legacy left by the United States. It serves as a reminder of the sacrifices the Marshallese made for American security and the broken promises they received in exchange. They blame the United States and other developed nations for global climate change and sea level rise, which threaten to destroy significant portions of this island nation's 29 low-lying atolls. During 5 trips to the Marshall Islands between 2018 and 2019, a reporting team from the Los Angeles Times and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism documented their discoveries. They found extensive coral bleaching, fish kills, and algae blooms in addition to major disease outbreaks, including the country's largest recorded dengue fever epidemic. According to research released in 2019 by a group of Columbia University scientists, the radiation levels in some areas of Eniwetok and other Marshall Islands are comparable to those found close to Chernobyl and Fukushima. Leaders in the Marshall Islands agree that America is not the only one to blame for the problems facing their country. However, they assert that the U.S. has not accepted responsibility for the environmental catastrophe it has caused, and that the country's officials have continuously misled them about the scope and depth of the damage. Marine pollution. In the modern world, marine pollution is becoming an increasingly chemicals and trash are the 2 primary sources of pollution in our ocean. Chemical pollution, also known as nutrient pollution, is hazardous to the environment, human health, and the economy. This kind of pollution happens when human activities, particularly the application of fertilizer on farms, cause chemical runoff into streams that eventually empty into the ocean. Algal blooms are promoted by the elevated levels of chemicals in the coastal water, such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which may be hazardous to wildlife and dangerous to humans. Algal blooms have a severe impact on the ecosystem and human health, which hurts the local fishing and tourist industries. The term marine trash refers to all man-made items that wind up in the water, the majority of which are made of plastic. This debris, which comes from land in 80% of cases, accumulates as a result of littering, storm gusts, and poor waste management. Numerous plastic items, such as shopping bags and beverage bottles, together with cigarette butts, bottle caps, food wrappers, and fishing equipment, are examples of common marine garbage. Being such a persistent contaminant, plastic waste is particularly harmful and could take hundreds of years to decompose. Both people and animals are at risk from this garbage. Fish can become entangled and hurt in the debris, and some animals mistakenly consume things like plastic bags, thinking they're food. Microplastic, or very small fragments of degraded plastic, can be consumed by small creatures, which then take the chemicals in the plastic and absorb them into their tissues. Microplastics have been found in a variety of marine organisms, including plankton and whales, and have a diameter of less than 5 millimeters. The poisonous compounds become a part of a bigger animal's tissues when they devour creatures that have absorbed microplastics. In this way, the contamination from microplastics moves up the food chain and finally ends up in the food that people eat. Preventative measures can be utilized as solutions for marine pollution. Today's civilizations use a lot of disposable and single-use plastic, including plastic bottles, shipping boxes, and shopping bags. The process of altering society's perspective on plastic consumption will be long and fiscally difficult. In contrast, some objects may be impossible to clean up. Numerous trash types, including certain plastics, do not float and are therefore lost in the depths of the ocean. In ocean gyres, plastics that do not float tend to accumulate in large patches. One such collection is the Pacific Garbage Patch, which spans an area of around 617,763 square miles between California and Hawaii. The trash island contains plastics and microplastics floating on and below the surface of whirling ocean currents. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, these patches are less like garbage islands and more like flecks of microplastic pepper swirling around in an ocean soup. The fight against marine pollution is hindered since many solutions are not considered viable options. Plastics marketed as biodegradable usually only decompose at temperatures that will never be reached in the ocean. Nevertheless, several nations are acting. A 2018 study from the United Nations has said that more than 60 countries have passed laws restricting or outlawing the use of throwaway plastic objects. Personal protective equipment. 2 years ago, it wasn't a major issue that throwaway face masks, gloves, and wipes might end up as worldwide environmental pollutants. PPE, or personal protective equipment, was thought to be crucial for stopping the spread of COVID-19. Nobody could have predicted so much would be required for so long. However, output skyrocketed, and the litter is now impossible to avoid. Since then, researchers have compiled a library of more than 40 studies that describe how PPE is used and disposed of worldwide, and they model how that would appear. Every month, 65 billion gloves are worn worldwide. The number of face masks sold each month is more than double that, at 129 billion. That amounts to 3 million face masks being worn every minute. According to a different survey, 3.4 billion face masks or face shields are thrown away daily, and Asia discards more face masks than any other region in the world each day. With 1.4 billion people, China has the biggest population in the world and discards nearly 702 million face masks per day. Several plastic fibers, mainly polypropylene, are used to make face masks, gloves, and wipes. These fibers will linger in the environment for many years, if not centuries, before breaking down into smaller microplastics and nanoplastics. According to research published in Environmental Advances, a single face mask can discharge as much as 173,000 microfibers into the ocean on a daily basis. Face masks and gloves that have been abandoned are blown into rivers and streams like tumbleweeds, where they eventually end up in the ocean. On South American beaches, river outlets in Jakarta Bay, Bangladesh, the coast of Kenya, and the deserted Soko Islands in Hong Kong, scientists have noted their existence. Discarded PPE has clogged equipment in Vancouver, British Columbia's municipal drainage system and obstructed street drains from New York City to Nairobi. PPE litter issues have arisen at a challenging point in the fight against plastic waste. In the next 20 years, the quantity of plastic garbage that is already piling up in the oceans is expected to quadruple, with no meaningful solutions in sight. The change would only lessen that anticipated doubling by 7% if every company's vow to use more recycled plastics were kept. 107,219 individual pieces of PPE trash were recorded in a global survey of volunteers who took part in beach cleanups in the summer of 2020. However, the group's founders came to the conclusion that this number is likely a huge underestimate. The volunteers themselves may be a better source of data, as 94% of them indicated they frequently saw face masks, gloves, and other PPE litter in their neighborhoods, and 50% said they saw PPE litter every day. A whopping 40% of respondents reportedly found PPE trash in streams, rivers, and oceans. Felicity Ace. The bottom of the Atlantic Ocean is currently covered with thousands of vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, oil, gas, and an entire cargo ship. The car transporter, Felicity Ace, sank on March 1, 2022, not far from the Portuguese Azores archipelago. Ecologists are now concerned that the carrier's invasion of the rich underwater habitat may be impacted by pollution from the disaster. Before listing to one side and sinking around 230 miles from the Azores, the ship, which was transporting hundreds of vehicles from Europe to the United States, caught fire about 2 weeks earlier. According to the International Law of Sea Convention, it's outside of Portuguese jurisdiction due to its location on the extended continental shelf. Felicity Ace is located 1.9 miles below the surface of the ocean. The wreck's influence on the seafloor made a devastating impression on the organisms that live there. When the ship sank, 4,000 vehicles, some of which had electric car batteries, and 2,200 tons of petrol and oil were released into the ocean. Only a small amount of the wreckage was visible above the water, but tugboats were using hoses to clean up a small amount of oil there. In order to keep an eye out for new indications of surface contamination, Portugal has kept a Navy ship and an Air Force plane stationed nearby. The oil and gas tanks, as well as the electric vehicle batteries, are the most hazardous components of the catastrophe. Ideally, they would be removed and brought back to land safely, but it's only a pipe dream at the moment. The cost would likely be extremely expensive, and it's unclear who would run such a huge operation. However, the structure could eventually become an artificial reef if no dangerous substances leak into the ocean. Currently, we know very little about the wreck's state of preservation. U-85. Between January and the end of August 1942, German U-boats attacked more than 285 vessels in the North American seas. The remains of many of these ships are scattered over the ocean floor, not far from the coast of North Carolina. The remains of this little-known battleground is now the final resting place for 90 ships and approximately 1,700 soldiers who died during the Battle of the Atlantic. 8 Allied convoy ships, 78 commercial freighters and tankers, and 4 German U-boats all sank off the coast of North Carolina throughout the course of the war. Every shipwreck tells a different tale. On March 21, 1942, U-85 embarked on its third and last voyage from Saint-Nazaire, France. The U-boat arrived in New Jersey after receiving orders to patrol off the American shore, and on April 10th of that same year, it discovered its first target. After sinking the Swedish steamer Christina Knutsen with 2 torpedoes, U-85 headed straight for Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. 3 days later, the crew of U-85 detected the USS Roper nearby and attempted an escape in extremely shallow water while being followed by the American vessel. They hoped their increased speed would get the U-boat into deeper water before Roper attacked them. The crew on board the American ship thought they were hunting a submarine as they got closer to U-85. They saw a torpedoes trail running down the port side, nearly missing the Roper, confirming their suspicions. However, Roper couldn't be shaken by U-85. As the space between the two ships closed, a surface conflict followed. The crew of Roper were manning the 3-inch deck guns and machine guns as they opened fire on the German sailors as they tried to leave the conning tower to man their weapons. In addition to having more surface artillery, Roper was also able to get their weapons faster. Then, a well-aimed 3-inch round breached the pressure hull just ahead of the U-85's conning tower. The captain of the U-85 must have made the decision to scuttle and abandon ship. Roper's crew observed the German sailors jump into the ocean and plead for help as the U-boat started to sink at the stern. At this point, Roper thought it had made another sonar contact. Unwilling to take any risks with another potential U-boat, the American ship sailed into the crowd of sailors in the sea and dropped another 11 depth charges in their direction. The whole U-85 crew were killed as a result. Roper made the second appearance around daybreak and found 29 sailors' dead bodies. The remains were returned to Norfolk, where they were eventually buried with full military honors in the shadows of Hampton National Cemetery in Virginia. Today, cemetery visitors may view the graves and read the names of the sailors whose bodies were recovered. The U-85's wreckage is currently 14 miles east of Oregon Inlet on the Outer Banks, submerged in water that is 110 feet deep. Due to the dynamic shifting currents, visibility and water temperature change greatly. The wreck is lying on its starboard side with a list of around 80 degrees. The bow, pressure hull, and the 4 forward torpedo tubes are visible because the outer shell has collapsed. Torpedoes can still be clearly seen within several of these tubes. Battle damage caused by Roper's 3-inch deck cannon is clearly evident to the left of the conning tower. The cannon of the USS Roper, which fired shells, left unmistakable evidence of its damage beyond the conning tower. The U-85 appears to still be searching for Allied ships to destroy, as its 88mm gun is directed toward the surface. For anyone who's witnessed this wreck for themselves, the scene is quite unsettling.
9. H.L. Hunley. The Confederate submarine CSS Hunley, also known as the H.L. Hunley, was built in Alabama during the early years of the Civil War. It entered battle for the first time in 1863, when it carried sailors into Charleston Harbor on a mission to destroy a Union blockade on the city. But something went wrong and the Hunley sank, killing 5 of its crew members. The sub underwent numerous repairs and was relaunched a few months later, but someone left a valve open and it sank again. This time, the entire 8-man crew died. Once again, the Confederate Navy fixed the vessel and put it back into service. It entered service for a third time in 1864. It was the first combat submarine to sink a warship, the U.S. Navy ship USS Housatonic, with a torpedo before vanishing along with its crew. A team of shipwreck hunters discovered the missing submarine right next to the Housatonic in 1995. The Hunley was raised from the bottom of the harbor 5 years later. Nobody knows what caused it to sink. The crew may have run out of oxygen and suffocated as the tides pushed the submarine off course, or it may have been clipped by another vessel. It's also possible that the Hunley was destroyed by its own torpedo, or that an enemy shooter somehow disabled the captain, rendering him incapable of operating the vehicle. Unfortunately, there's no way of knowing for sure what happened. 8. Tombstone linked to massacre. On August 21, 1863, a Confederate guerrilla group known as Quantrill's Raiders brutally attacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas, killing around 150 unarmed men and boys. For years, Kansas had been at the center of a bitter divide between abolitionists who wanted to join the Union and pro-slavery Confederate sympathizers. This particularly violent era, known as the Bleeding Kansas period, came at a time when Kansas was still just a territory and had not yet been granted statehood. And with the states more divided than ever before, both the North and South seemed to want Kansas on their team. The Quantrill Raid, also known as the Lawrence Massacre, was launched as an act of revenge in response to an earlier campaign by militant abolitionists known as Jayhawkers, who tried putting an end to civilian support for Confederate guerrillas. In other words, it was essentially the continuation of a turf war between informal gangs who both had reputations for being vicious and ruthless. In 2019, local resident Chad Gustin and his 2 kids found 2 large and visibly old tombstones on the family's property next to the Kansas River. They notified local historians, who determined that one of the gravestones, bearing the name James O'Neill, belonged to the burial of a man who was killed in the Lawrence Massacre. O'Neill was working on a bridge when he was murdered, according to the Lecompton Historical Society. He was originally buried at a different cemetery that was destroyed about 50 years before Gustin and his kids discovered his headstone, which had been relocated from its previous site. The other tombstone paid tribute to a Lane University student who drowned in 1877. 7. Surgeon's Pit. The Second Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Second Manassas, broke out on August 28, 1862 in Prince William County, Virginia. It ended 2 days later with a sweeping Confederate victory, forcing the Union Army to retreat during its attempt to travel south. Nearly 14,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded. Wounded men were treated at a field hospital. With limited medical tools, very little time to perform tedious procedures, and the tendency for wounds to become infected, amputation was often the easiest and quickest way for combat surgeons to keep catastrophically injured soldiers alive. When left with no other choice, surgeons sometimes performed amputations without anesthesia. but the vast majority of the operations were carried out with the use of ether and/or chloroform, which was better than nothing. Tens of thousands of limbs were amputated throughout the war, but researchers only recently got their first glimpse into how the severed body parts were handled. In 2014, utility workers found bones and bone fragments at the Manassas National Battlefield Park. Archaeologists noticed that most of them were leg and arm bones, bearing cut marks, and realized they'd found a surgeon's pit where amputated limbs were buried. It was the first Civil War limb pit to be excavated and studied. Many of the bones had bullets lodged in them, revealing the gruesome nature of the wounds that the amputees suffered from. The team also uncovered the near-complete skeletal remains of 2 Union soldiers who died from their injuries, and some of their uniform buttons. They were reburied in coffins built from a downed tree on the battlefield. The discoveries helped experts better understand both the Second Manassas and Civil War medicine. According to the latest update, the team who studied the bones planned to try identifying who the amputated bones belonged to and research whether they survived their amputations. 6. Agnes E. Fry. Built in Scotland in 1864, the iron-hulled paddle steamer Agnes E. Fry originally operated as a merchant ship called the Fox. During the Civil War, it fell under the command of Confederate naval captain Joseph Fry, who renamed it after his wife. The Confederacy repurposed the 236-foot-long ship as a blockade runner and used it to evacuate Union naval blockades. As the war entered its final months in early 1865, the Fry ran aground off the North Carolina coast. By then, the military had less of a need for blockade runners. The wreck sat in shallow water for years, as its copper, engines, and other valuable materials were removed. In 1910, the US Army Corps of Engineers knocked what was left of the wreck apart and dragged it under the water, where it was forgotten about for more than a century. In 2016, archaeologists located a vessel matching the Agnes E. Fry's dimensions near Oak Island. It sits just 18 feet below the surface, but the water's visibility is extremely poor, making it nearly impossible for someone to see it with the naked eye. The wreck is still laden with its cargo, which is rare among Civil War-era wrecks and could teach archaeologists a lot about the past. It's unclear whether researchers plan to salvage any of the artifacts. 5. The Bixby Letter Mystery. In 1864, a grieving mother from Boston named Lydia Bixby received a sympathetic letter after losing all 5 of her sons in the Civil War. Known as the Bixby Letter, it was signed A. Lincoln. But whether or not then-President Abraham Lincoln actually wrote the letter has long been a subject of debate. Some believe that Lincoln's secretary, John Hay, penned the note and signed his boss's name. The original copy of the letter has been missing for over a century, forcing experts to rely on facsimiles in their attempts to solve the mystery. In 2017, experts developed computer programs that employ sophisticated new technology to look for linguistic sequences. They use the programs to analyze hundreds of texts written by Lincoln and Hayes. The team examined the text in the Bixby Letter, then searched for the absence of certain words in various pieces written by the men. Their findings indicated that the letter was most likely written by Hayes because it contains more similarities to his other texts. 90% of the results pointed toward Hayes authoring the note, while the other 10% turned up inconclusive. While some may find it disappointing that Lincoln most likely didn't write the letter, it wasn't a bad decision for him to delegate the task to Hayes, who was a talented and accomplished writer. And while the new technology that the scholars used seems pretty reliable, the findings are not indisputable. If you could choose anyone that's ever lived to write you a letter, who would you choose? Tell us in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 4. S.G. Elliot Burial Map. Researchers from the Adams County Historical Society in Pennsylvania were looking for information on the Battle of Gettysburg one day in 2020 when they came across a map they had never seen before. Created by mapmaker Simon G. Elliott, it detailed the temporary burials of 5,844 soldiers who died at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland on September 17, 1862. It was the deadliest single-day battle in American history, claiming nearly 23,000 lives. In addition to featuring the burials of 2,364 Union and 3,210 Confederate soldiers, Elliott's map also details the burial of 269 horses and the locations of 152 cannons. Researchers Timothy Smith and Andrew Dalton were browsing through the New York Public Library's archives when they found the map, which had been digitized but was unknown to experts until then. Elliot most likely created it in the fall of 1864, around the same time he made a map of temporary burials after the Battle of Gettysburg. The Antietam map shed new light on the events of what had been described as the bloodiest day in US history. Until its discovery, researchers had no way of knowing who was buried where in the battle's immediate aftermath, since the graves were temporary and the fallen soldiers were all reburied elsewhere. Elliot's map offered the first and only insight into where the temporary burials were and who was buried there. Because fallen soldiers were typically buried very close to where they died, the map has helped experts learn the arrangement of the troops and where different units fought. It also revealed that dozens of men were once buried in the vicinity of the battlefield's modern-day Welcome Center. 3. A lost cemetery. In recent years, archaeologists have received information from local residents about a lost cemetery in Sussex County, Delaware. Acting on tips about its suspected location, they began excavating and soon discovered a Civil War-era headstone belonging to a soldier named C.S. Hall. The writing on the tombstone identified him as a soldier who served in an African-American regiment called the 32nd U.S. Colored Troops. Hall's grave marker was found on private land known as the Orr property, or the Hall Plantation, where the team had been hired by the owner to search for the cemetery. They unearthed at least 9 more graves at the site before announcing news of the discovery. The researchers admittedly knew nothing about the people buried at the property, including whether any of them were slaves or former slaves. They were also unable to link Hall's tombstone with a specific grave. At the time of the discovery, the team announced plans to continue investigating the site in hopes of learning more about the people buried there so that they can be properly memorialized. 2. Mysterious human remains. While digging the foundation for a new building in August of 2022, a property developer in Nashville unearthed some human remains. He made the discovery near a Civil War fort and a cemetery dating back to 1822, presenting the possibility that the bones could be up to 2 centuries old. The fort, which is located about a half-mile away from the development project, was built for the Union by runaway and freed former slaves. After making the initial discovery, the company requested permission from a local court to relocate the remains to a nearby historic cemetery. An archaeologist determined that the bones are not of Native American origin and that they appear to be isolated burials rather than part of a cemetery. While it'll take time to determine their exact age, they're thought to date back to the early 19th century. It's possible that they're older or younger. It'll take time for researchers to gain an idea of who the individuals were. They could be Civil War soldiers, settlers, or perhaps workers who helped build the fort. Historian Leah Williams, who specializes in African-American Civil War and Reconstruction studies, told ABC that it's less likely for the pair to be black laborers because the burials contain evidence of coffins, which were rarely used in African-American burials. The only way to know for sure is to run scientific tests on the remains and continue to explore the site for more clues about its past. 1. CSS Georgia. Built in Savannah in 1862, the Confederate warship CSS Georgia was built with help from a group of merchants' wives known as the Ladies' Gunboat Society. The women funded the vessel's construction by collecting $115,000 in donations from benefactors across the state. But there were limits to the power of their good intentions and generosity. The ship's steam engines were too weak for offensive combat use or to power it through the Savannah River's powerful tidal waters. Instead of trying to use it for its intended purpose, the Confederate Navy parked it upstream and used it as a floating battery for defending Savannah. The CSS Georgia fulfilled this role until the Confederates caught wind that Union General William T. Sherman was advancing toward the city in late 1864. Instead of letting the ship fall into Northern hands, they sank it. During the process of salvaging its ironclad armor in 1866, the wooden hull shattered. The wreck was then forgotten about until its rediscovery in 1968. By the time the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began raising it in 2013, much of the ship was destroyed. During the recovery effort, salvage crews raised 4 cannons, 132 unexploded cannonballs, engine parts, an intact propeller, and siding. They pulled what's left of the wreck from the river in 10,000-pound sections measuring roughly 4 by 24 feet each. Experts are studying the retrieved portions of the Georgia to learn more about Confederate shipbuilding practices, which were carried out in the absence of a naval industry. Thanks for watching. Which one of these discoveries shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.